Hi folks, so what we're going to look at today is private nuisance. We'll do the AO1 on this video and then I will do an AO3 one, which is the evaluation for an essay. Okay, the first point, the claimant can bring a tort of nuisance if their enjoyment of their land is affected by the defendant's actions. So this is civil law, the burden of proof is on the claimant and they have to prove it to the balance of probabilities. Now the structure for nuisance, I'm going to do it into 4 elements. I think this helps structure an essay, it also helps structure a problem question. Okay, element 1, the claimant must have an interest in the land to bring a claim. This means, it's very simple, it just means they own or rent the land, and you can quote the case of Hunter. The next issue, the defendant can be sued if they are in possession or control of the land, and if they are the ones allowing or causing the nuisance. The fourth point that I've written is the nuisance can be a natural cause, and that's the case of Leakey. The moment the defendant is aware of the nuisance, then they do have a duty to take action to prevent it. So the fifth point is element 2. So element 2, there must be an unlawful use of the land. Now, unlawful means unreasonable in the way that it affects the claimant. This interference can be indirect, so for example, noise or fumes, and again, quote a case, and the case here is tipping. Sixth point, the court has to decide if the use of the land was unreasonable. So we've said unlawful means unreasonable, and now the courts have to consider various factors of reasonableness. And what I'm going to explain in a minute is they are going to look at location or locality, social benefit, duration, malice, sensitivity of the claimant. So these are things the courts will look at to decide if the interference is reasonable or if it is unreasonable. So point number 7 is the locality. They consider the location and the local area. So for example, is it the countryside or is it the city? In a city, you would expect more noise, so things are less likely to be a nuisance in a city. Sturgis and Bridgman stated that what would be considered a nuisance in Belgrave Square would not necessarily be a nuisance in Bermondsey. So that's kind of suggesting that in a very fancy, posh area, that any noise is going to be a nuisance, whereas in a more, I don't know what word you'd use to describe it, but in a less posh area, you're supposed to put up with more noise and fumes, which I think has equality issues, but we'll look at that in evaluation. So location. Then we've got social benefit. The use of the land is likely to be reasonable if it provides a social benefit to the local community, and you can quote Miller. So for example, a sports club or a factory providing jobs. The next factor that the courts would look at as to whether it's reasonable is the duration. So the longer the nuisance goes on for, the more likely it is to be classed as unreasonable. And that's the Crown River Cruises case. Also, the time of day is important. So for example, if it's at night time, if this noise is at night time, it's more likely to be a nuisance because it's unreasonable. The 10th point is malice. So a deliberate and malicious act is highly likely to be unreasonable, and you can quote the Silver Fox Farm case. The 11th point is about the sensitivity of the claimant. So if the claimant or the claimant's equipment is particularly sensitive, then it's not going to be an unreasonable nuisance or unreasonable use of the land. So the case is the Network Rail case. The claimant's amps were particularly sensitive, so that was not unreasonable. So that's element 2, quite a lot of detail there needed for element 2. Element 3 is about defences. So the defendant has a range of defences that they are able to claim. So the burden is on them to claim these defences. So the first thing is prescription. And this is quite straightforward. It just means that the claimant has 20 years in which to bring a claim. Therefore, if it has been longer than 20 years that this noise has been going on for, or the fumes, it's not classed as a nuisance. So the defendant would have the defence of prescription. The other one that quite often comes up in scenario questions, statutory authority. This just means permission. So if the defendant has permission to operate a factory, build a sports club, they've got permission from the council or they've got planning permission, then that is a defence. And you can quote the case of Allen versus Gulf Oil. Another possible defence is consent. The case of Morris, he got into an aeroplane with a drunk pilot. He'd been drinking, so he knew the dangers. So that's another full defence. And then finally, a partial defence, contributory negligence. The effect of contributory negligence is that it reduces the amount of damages that the claimant will receive because they are partially at fault. And you can quote the case of Froome, which is somebody not wearing a seatbelt, and there was a car crash. It was the other people's fault, but their injuries were worse due to them not wearing a seatbelt, so they would get less money and compensation. And then finally, element 4, very straightforward. These are the remedies. What does the claimant want? Well, you've got pecuniary damages. So if you can put an amount on the damage to you or your property, then that's pecuniary. Non-pecuniary means you get damages for your loss and suffering and your pain. So if you've had sleepless nights because of all the noise or things like that, you would get non-pecuniary damages. And then the other remedy is the possibility of an injunction. So this is a court order that will stop the defendant behaving in a certain way, or it might be some kind of injunction to get them to modify their behaviour. So instead of having jet ski races 7 days a week, they might be told they can only have jet ski races 5 days a week. Okay, so hopefully that has helped clarify the AO1, and as I said, I will be doing a video on the AO3.